Now, one of the most important skills that you'll develop as you improve your programming skills is how to actually read your program and the code that you write like a computer would. And so don't worry, this isn't as hard as it sounds, and you won't be reading a whole lot of ones and zeros. But it's really important to see how the computer is going to be interpreting your code. So let's have a look at this basic class and see what's happening. So I've got a whole lot of print statements here, and what I'm going to do is simply just run it. And a neat little feature that we have in IntelliJ is you can actually just click this green arrow here, and what that will do is it'll run this main method here. So I'm going to hit run, and let's see what happens. And so what we can see is it prints out, this is the first statement, the second statement, I love apples, and then this is the last statement. And as we can see, this corresponds to the order of the statements we have here. Okay, and that's because a program literally just reads the code from the top to the bottom, and that's it. And this is known as the control flow of a program, and it's essentially how the program, flows. But sometimes we may find that we only want certain pieces of code to execute based on certain conditions. And so in this instance, we may only actually want the phrase I love apples to print if the person actually loves apples. And so that's where we can introduce the concept of an if statement. So it will literally run as if something is true, then it will execute a bit of code. So let's see how that looks. And it's literally just if, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the word true there, which it always evaluates to true. And we'll leave that there for now. So if true, then what we do is we open up with a curly brace, and then we close it up with a curly brace. But what we can actually do is if we just hit enter, we can notice that IntelliJ closes it up for us. And a lot of the time, this can actually be a source of errors if you don't close a brace after opening it. So I'm going to just grab this code, and I'll put it in between these braces. And so now let's see what happens if I run this. So we still get the same output. And that's because it runs the first statement, then the second statement, and then it comes to this line, and it says, well, if this is true, and true is always true, then it will execute this piece of code. And then it carries on like normal. However, we can actually change this and put in anything that can evaluate to true or false. So one data type that we've used already, which does, is a boolean. So I'm going to create a boolean, and I'm going to call it loves apples. And then so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by setting this to false. And then if I swap this out for loves apples, then what happens is if I run this, well, we should get the first statement, then the second statement, then it will be the if statement will evaluate this and say if this is true, I'm going to execute the code here, and otherwise if not, which we're going to see it's false, then it will just ignore it and skip over to this part here. So let's run that and see. And as we can see, it shows this is the first statement, this is the second statement, and this is the last statement. However, this condition here isn't actually just restricted to Boolean values, and we can put the Boolean data type in, but we can actually use anything that evaluates to either true or false. So let's change this. And here we're going to introduce the equals operator. And so the way we would check, say, if two numbers are equal, is we'll use the equals sign. So what we could do is say, is 1 equal to 1? Okay, and we've got a little message saying condition 1 equals 1 is always true, because, well, 1 is always going to be equal to 1. So now if we run this, then we can see, well, 1 will always equal 1, so it'll be true. And so we'll get the statement being printed out. Okay? And this isn't just limited to numbers, we can also use variables as well. So if I create a variable int num equals, say, 3, and then I can swap this for 3. I can swap this for num, and I'll run that. And then we can see, obviously 3 is not equal to 1, and so it'll be false, and we won't have this statement printed out. But what if we wanted it to print something else if the statement wasn't true? So say I wanted to print apples if I loved apples, else I wanted it to print I don't love apples. So that lets us introduce the concept of an else statement. And here we literally just say else, and then we introduce those curly brackets again, and if I hit enter, it'll print it out for me again. And then I'm going to use the system.out.print command, and I'm going to say I don't love apples. Okay? And so let's have a look at this. So essentially it's going to say Well, if it's true, then it'll print this. Else, it'll print I don't love apples. And so that's really important. It won't actually print both of these. It'll only ever print one based on this condition. So now let's run this and see what happens. And if I hit run, then we see it prints, this is the first statement, the second statement, and then it says, I don't love apples, okay? And that's because it's printing this statement out because this is false. And then it goes and it proceeds like normal and goes to the next statement, this is the last statement. And so something useful to note is that we have an error message or sort of yellow highlight coming up here. So it's not quite an error and it won't stop us running our program. But it's more of IntelliJ just helping us out and saying that the condition is always going to be false. And we can see that's quite obvious because 3 is never going to be equal to 1. And so it's just telling us that because it's always false, we won't actually ever get this condition printed out. And we can actually have any condition we want here. So anything that evaluates to true or false can be put in between these brackets, and we can use in our if and else statement. And so that's essentially the control flow using if and else statements of our basic Java programs. And what we're going to do is we'll be moving on to a bit more complicated stuff when we look at while, do while, and for loops in the next video. Now all the code for this video can be accessed via the link below in my Git repository. So I hope you've found this content useful, and if you have, please like, share, and subscribe.